Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Schlossberg, and I'm the director of the Sydney Environment Institute and a professor of environmental politics at the University of Sydney. Along with the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, we are co-hosting today's event, New South Wales Climate Update 2021. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, though tonight I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and to their knowledges about the relationship between human and non-human people and environment that they sustained for millennia on this continent. These knowledges will be crucial to repairing the destructive environmental management and ecological damage caused by a combination of colonialism and extractivism over the last 250 years. This event is one of a series of climate update events taking place in the ACT, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland this month. The goal of the events is fairly simple, and that is to highlight how our climate is changing and how we can respond. We're going to focus tonight specifically on transition. I want to thank Mark Howden for inviting the Sydney Environment Institute to partner today. And I want to start by thanking the combined staff of both institutes, in particular Lamis Kazak and Eloise Vedder-Place, for the work that's gone into constructing the event. So today the focus will be on climate change in New South Wales, and as I said, in particular, on different approaches to thinking about how we transition in the face of that climate reality. That includes energy transition and the state's role, just transition and the inclusion of impacted communities, and transition that takes seriously Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander understandings and experiences of changing environments. Now, all of you in the audience can submit questions at any time in the Q&A box in the bottom panel. I think after a year of this, everyone knows how this works. We'll get to answering them in the Q&A session after the talks. You can vote, and please do, on your favorite questions in the Q&A box, so you can vote up the questions. Just click on the thumbs up next to your favorite questions. So I'll start by introducing the speakers, or I'll introduce the speakers as it's their turn to speak. And first up, with an overview of our climate situation, is Professor Mark Howden. Professor Howden is director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's also an honorary professor at Melbourne University, a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and a member of the Australian National Climate Science Advisory Committee. Mark?
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for co-hosting this event with us tonight. So just before I start, I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands who I'm sit, which is the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to particularly acknowledge that through their long history of occupation of this land, they've actually been through many climate changes themselves and adjusted to those changes. So what I'm going to do today is I'll just share my screen and then move into the presentation. Hopefully this is the right one. So Lamisa or Juliet, have we got a full screen there?
It's on the presentation view. So if you just change screens, you might be able to see the full screen.
Right, yeah. Okay, I'll change that again and hopefully get it right this time. So that and where's it gone? It's not showing up, but so we've got it now.
It's on the PowerPoint, but not presentation view. Should we jump in?
It's just not working. So, sorry about this. So share screen. Still no?
It's just on the display setting. So would you like me to share your slides, Mark? Is that
go for it, Juliet.
just get those up. 1 second. Just stop your share.
Thanks, Juliet. So what I'm going to do here is just to give a really quick update of the science, particularly just focusing on things that have changed in the last year or so. And of course, this is a very small subset of what's gone on in that science domain. So next slide, Juliet. So one of the critical things here, so onto the next slide, Juliet. Yep. So one of the critical things, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions. And from the Global Carbon Project results that you see in front of you, we have increased our greenhouse gas emissions pretty much year on year for a long time now. But because of COVID, what we've actually saw last year was a decrease. So if you compare what's gone on, if we go back 3 decades or so, we're about 22 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. This is fossil fuel-based CO2 per year, increasing to around about 36 billion tonnes the year before last. And so last year we had about a 6.77% decrease in those emissions, and so which is not insubstantial, but it actually is relatively small compared with the long-term emissions from carbon dioxide. And I'll talk about what this means in terms of our carbon budgets a little bit later. But really, one of the critical questions for us is what happens next year? Do we keep on going downwards, or do we level off at this sort of reduced level, or do we actually bounce back and go back to where we were before? And this is really important because even though we've actually seen a decrease last year, is that actually is not significant enough to even show up on the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And part of the reason why is because we're operating at such a large scale, and because the elements of how this works in terms of dynamics actually counter against that sort of rapid response. So for every one of these billions of tonnes of carbon dioxide, roughly a quarter gets absorbed into the ocean. A little bit more than a quarter gets absorbed into the land, the trees and grass and soils, and the remaining roughly half accumulates in the atmosphere. So in a sense, we're in a very saturated system where small reductions in this total emissions make very little difference to actually how much accumulates in the atmosphere year on year. And it's really important because carbon dioxide lasts for a couple of hundred years in the atmosphere. So this year's excess builds on last year's excess and builds on the previous year's excess, etc. And that's why we're getting buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Next slide, please, Juliet. So as a consequence, we've seen really substantial increases in carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere. So today, where it's sitting around about 417 parts per million, when I was born, it was 100 parts per million less than it is today. And this just keeps on going up and up, almost like regardless of the little blips that we see, like the global financial crisis or COVID. We've also got record levels of methane, particularly from the fossil fuel gas sector and also agriculture, record levels of nitrous oxide, particularly from agriculture, and record levels of other greenhouse gases, including carbon CFCs. So the drivers of climate change, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, just keep on accumulating. Next slide. And so what this means is that we've known for about 150 years that if we put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it'll warm the Earth. If we put more of them, it'll warm the Earth even more. So what you see here is a record of temperatures going back about 150 years. We can see that particularly over the last 4 or 5 decades, we've had this very sustained increase in temperature, and last year was the equal warmest year on record. So it was about 1.24 degrees above the pre-industrial average when we look at the global record. In Australia, it was warm, but not the warmest on record. It was the 4th warmest on record averaged across Australia. In New South Wales, it wasn't particularly warm. but it was amongst the relatively wet years. So it was a couple of 100 millimetres above the long-term average. So it was in the wettest 20 years. And that wetness, largely driven by La Nina, actually helped cool New South Wales and the eastern part of Australia in the latter half of the year, simply because there was more water around. Next slide. So when we actually start to think about what this might mean at a global scale, because it's not just Australia that's warming, we get pictures like this. So this comes from NASA last year, and we can see warming is right across the globe, with the exception of a small patch down in Antarctica. And in particularly, what we saw was really, really strong warming signals in the Arctic, and particularly around Siberia. Next slide. And we saw record temperatures happening in the Arctic Siberian area with 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a new high in those areas. And that, of course, impacted on things like the ocean ice in the Arctic. And so, which was the second lowest on record, continuing the long-term reduction in area, but more significantly in volume. Next slide. And of course, that heat, amongst other things, helped generate the Black Summer fires and the disaster that was. And I don't think any retrospective of last year can actually go without commenting on this in Australia. So in Australia, about 8 million Australians were affected, particularly by smoke, including those in Sydney and Canberra and other places. 34 lives were lost directly, and about 430 were lost indirectly from conditions that were worsened by smoke inhalation. Over 2,500 homes were destroyed, and lots of other infrastructure with immense cost, possibly the most expensive natural hazard event in Australia's history. We had huge numbers, almost impossible to count, numbers of wild animals which were dead, and we've seen horrific pictures of what that means. Some 18.5 million hectares were burnt, larger than many European countries, and some of it hasn't recovered. So you can still go to some places and it still is ash and bare soil. And in amongst that, we see a clear fingerprint of climate change in various respects. And so analyses have shown that this event was much more likely with climate change than it would have been in the absence of human-induced climate change. But reflecting on what it was like last year compared with what it was like this year is that just shows how sensitive we are to climate factors and what a big difference a La Nina makes with the rainfall and cooler temperatures that tends to bring here. But really important to recognise that these changes, this variability, these extremes are happening globally, whether it's the west coast of the US or whether it's heat waves in Europe, etc. And they're happening globally, and the fingerprint of climate change is increasing year by year. So next slide, please. And as partly in response to that, with increased temperatures, we see our sea levels keep on getting higher. We can see this graph coming from NASA showing the global sea level on average. And parts of the coast just off New South Wales are some of the global hotspot for sea level rise, with parts of that area off the coast increasing by 10 millimetres per year, as shown by a recent study by Benavista et al., which is a global sea level consortium. And this has obvious implications for coastal dwellers, including those in Sydney, but right up and down the New South Wales coast and around the Australian coast. Next slide, please. And seas keep on getting hotter, so they're not only getting higher, but they're also getting hotter. This is global ocean heat content showing different records, but that just keeps on going up and up. A very clear signal in terms of climate change across the globe. Next slide. And of course, the temperature of oceans is linked to our cyclones that we experience, both the strength of those cyclones, and their frequency, and also their geographical extent. And a recent study showed that the proportion of very severe cyclones, that's the category 3, 4, and 5 cyclones, is increasing over time, over the last several decades. And if we look at the seas around Australia, the Southern Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean, we see a similar trend, that a higher proportion of the cyclones that we experience are those category 3, 4, and 5 cyclones, consistent with that pattern across the globe. Next slide. And generally speaking, when we start to look at what the science has said in the last year, what we see is the picture gets worse and worse the more we know. So if we look at previous estimates of climate sensitivity to doubling of carbon dioxide, the fifth assessment report from IPCC had a range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. That was what they called the likely range. And recent re-evaluations, including by some of the people on the call this evening, have changed that to 2.3 to 4.5. So the lower level has increased. And that's also consistent with paleo and historical evidence. And what this means, that increased sensitivity to a given amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, means that the possibilities for scenarios which have high greenhouse gas emissions but low climate change are increasingly unlikely. But these studies are also unable to rule out the higher end sensitivity values, which means that a high emission scenario leading to ultra high climate change can't be ruled out. What we also saw in terms of the science is the best estimate of when 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial may occur has been brought forward by about 10 years compared with the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. So instead of being in the early 2040s, now it's anticipated to be in the early 2030s. And the World Met Office said that there's around about 1 in 4 chance that 1.5 degrees Celsius will be exceeded at least once in the next 4 years. So we're coming to that sort of 1.5 degrees threshold faster than we anticipated. Next slide, please. And of course, this makes heat waves much worse. This is a recent study which looked at heat wave duration and number for Queensland. And the green sort of patch of numbers here reflects what might happen under a 1.5 degrees scenario change. So significant increases in both the duration and the number of events. As we go to a 2 degrees, we move to the orange colours. As we go to a 3 degrees, we move to the pinky red colours. And you can see under those pinky red colours, the duration of heat waves is going to become much, much greater. And the frequency of those heat waves is going to become much, much greater, to the extent that what would have been in the past as an extreme event happens over something like potentially a third of the year. A really significant change. And next slide. And these changes are likely to happen right across the globe. So recent studies showed that more than 1 billion people are likely to suffer from these sorts of heat extremes annually by 2100. Next slide. And drought becomes much worse at a global level. And you can see from this graph, which is a very recent study, that Australia is pretty much amongst the worst hit, and particularly southwest and southeastern Australia. And so the concerns that we have about drought are likely to be amplified. And next slide. And if we look at an Australian-oriented study, which came out last year, what that showed is, as we go towards the end of the century, is that the number and nature of droughts is likely to become worse and worse over time. So what this graph shows, without going into any detail, is that across every one of the regions that they looked at, drought is likely to become worse. And by the end of the century, we're likely to have what we currently call drought in something like an average of 50% of years. So really significant changes in the nature of extreme droughts and other droughts. So next slide. And what these sorts of studies also show is that there's a climate change reduces in our parts of the world the total water storage. So this is another global study, but if you look at what is likely to happen in Australia, both in the southwest and the southeast, we see some very significant reductions in total water storage. That's water on our landscape. And this is very consistent with previous studies, including the last IPCC assessment. Next slide. And the more we know about things like sea level, the more concerned we get. So what this graph shows is that temperature on the bottom axis and sea level rate of rise, which is in meters per century on the vertical axis. And if we look at what the IPCC fifth assessment report, say for a 1.5 degrees increase, we would have got something like 0.6 of a meter per century increase in sea level. With the last IPCC report, the Oceans and Cryosphere report, At 1.5, it was a little bit higher, so almost around about 0.7. But a very recent study has actually shown that a much greater sensitivity per unit temperature rise. And that study by Grinstead and Christensen indicated something like about 0.8 or 0.86 of a metre per century at 1.5. And an expert judgment, which from a different set of studies, which is the vertical bars, indicates even higher sensitivity to temperature rise through including a range of potential other feedbacks based on expert judgment. So again, the more we know, the more concerned we get. Next slide. And these accumulation of these impacts is likely to result in very significant losses. So the Reserve Bank, hardly a radical institution, warns of massive GDP losses by 2100 unless we take good action on climate change to reduce emissions and to adapt. Next slide. So one of the solutions, of course, to doing this is to stop collecting evidence. If the more we know, the worse it gets, well, perhaps in a Trump environment, one of the solutions is simply just to do less research. And of course, that's a sarcastic comment, but the very fact that in one of the biggest countries on earth with the most investment in R&D can actually have a conversation which says, do less evidence assessment and collecting is a really significant concern. Next slide. So luckily in Australia, we don't have that sort of debate to any great extent. And what this Lowy Institute poll shows is that there is very substantial public support for action on climate change with pretty much consistent messages that around 90% of Australians want more action on climate change. And in particular, next slide, this occurs in New South Wales, where we've got the New South Wales Environment Minister, who will speak in a minute, saying experts should lead climate change response. We should have an evidence base for making decisions. And you know, why should we ignore that evidence when we're making critical decisions for our state, for our nation? Next slide. And one of the things that's driving this, of course, is that even though we have the Paris Agreement goals, which are to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees, or if possible to 1.5 degrees, is that a very recent study, one out just in the last week, showed that on current trends, the probability of staying below 2 degrees of warming is only 5%. So if we keep on doing what we're doing, we've got a 1 in 20 chance of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees. Even if all countries actually meet their current nationally determined contributions and then continue to reduce emissions at the same rate, so you know, continuing the trend line of emission reductions downwards after 2030, the likelihood of staying below 2 degrees Celsius only rises to about 26%, in other words, 1 in 4. That means there's a 3 in 4 chance that we will exceed 2 degrees given current scenarios of emission reduction. So next slide. So the last part of the talk that I wanted to have was about what we say, which is a carbon dioxide budget approach. So we hear a lot about going net zero in the various political discourses. And something like 120 countries across the globe have now got a net zero by 2050 or sometimes earlier and sometimes later target. And when we talk about net zero, it sounds like that's actually the whole game. But as I'll show you, it's actually only part of the game that we need to think about. There's only part of the set of goals we need to have. Now, the fundamental part of the carbon budget approach is that there is demonstrably a very strong and almost linear relationship between the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions, that's this year's plus last year's plus the year before, etc., and global temperature increase. So that's the red line, the diagonal red line that goes up to the right. And the sort of shaded area around that just indicates that there's some uncertainty around about that for various reasons. Now, what this actually means, this linear relationship means, is that we can relatively simply say, well, for any given temperature goal, like 2 degrees, we can actually calculate what the total amount of carbon dioxide emissions we can have from historical times to the present and to the future that is consistent with that given temperature goal. which is actually a really handy thing to have. So we can actually make those calculations with a fair degree of certainty. But it's not quite that simple. So next slide, because what we have to take into account is a few different things. So if we have a given temperature goal, we in a sense have to subtract from this the locked in warming. That's the warming that's accumulated from past greenhouse gas emissions. We also have to subtract from that the warming associated with non-carbon dioxide gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And once we do that, we can look at that vertical line which drops down from the diagonal down towards the carbon dioxide accumulation axis. Next slide. But again, we have to take one more step before we can do the carbon budget. And that is we again have to subtract an element for what we call Earth system feedbacks. So that's the sorts of feedbacks that occur when warming melts permafrost, generates methane, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which generates more warming. And when we've done that, then we can look at what the remaining carbon dioxide budget is that's consistent with any given temperature goal. So if we go to the next slide, and what those sorts of calculations show is that we can now emit around about 390 gigatons of carbon dioxide and still have a 50-50 chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That sounds pretty good. 390 billion tonnes is a lot. But unfortunately, our current emissions are around 42 gigatons per year. So at current rates, the simple math, 390 divided by 42, gives around about 9.3 years of current emissions, if we keep on emitting at the same rate we are today, before we have to go to net zero and still have a fair chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And to give a scale of what this means is that the reduction in emissions from last year from COVID, that 6.7% reduction in emissions, buys us about 3.5 weeks grace in that calculation. So all of the pain and suffering in terms of reduced travel and reduced flights and changes in other economic activity buys us 3.5 weeks. And if you're thinking about 2 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees, those numbers are around about 27 years. So we can keep on emitting for another 27 years before we've done our dough and in terms of keeping to 2 degrees. And of course, if we accept lower probabilities of staying within the Paris Agreement goals, like a 30% chance of staying below 2, then we add a few extra years to that. But the key message here is that every year that we delay large-scale mitigation, emission reduction, it really matters in terms of future change in the world. Next slide. And so, next slide. So when we actually think about that, it means that for a given temperature goal, the time to net zero is not fixed. It is a function of achieving interim targets. If we keep on emitting at the current level, then we have to go to net zero much, much sooner than if we start to reduce our emissions now, in which case we can push out that net zero date. So when someone's talking to you about net zero essentially as being the whole story in terms of emission reduction, it's not. Those midterm targets, the interim targets in 2030 and 2040 are just as important as the date of net zero in terms of the carbon budget project. And because of the things that I've already shown you in terms of the implications of climate change for Australia, in terms of heat waves and drought, etc., this is crucial in terms of the future of our nation. It is not a vanity project, as some politicians have said. And increasingly, it is clear that action on climate change in terms of reducing our emissions and adapting to climate change is much, much less costly than inaction. So we really need to act quickly. Next slide. So just a few key messages here from what I've talked about today. There is accumulating evidence of climate change and the impacts of climate change, and the news is not good. With our future projections of climate change, it looks worse the more we know. So the more understanding we have of climate change, the more we can get concerned about the future trajectory for Australia. This leads to a conclusion that rapid and substantial action is needed and is also publicly supported, which is a really good story. And we also see significant industry support. So we see companies right across the globe, and including in Australia, taking very active roles in terms of reducing emissions. And there's a really strong and substantial research base, which is showing how that can be done and the logic of doing that in a very substantial way. And lastly, greenhouse gas emissions arise from the activities of all of us. So we all have roles to play in this together, hopefully a combination of individual action and policy action at the same time, because that's the way we can make the big difference quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for once again a very specific and very sobering presentation for a Monday afternoon. You know, we've both been at this for quite a long time from different disciplinary perspectives, and the information keeps on getting more and more specific, more and more dire, and yet the possibilities are still there. One of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the mitigation side of things, and I'll introduce Matt Keane, the Minister for Energy and Environment, in a minute. But we'll also talk about what these shifts and, you know, there's this net zero idea, but what does that mean in communities? What do the impacts mean in communities? What does the transition mean in communities? And those are just as important to engage in order to get more and more public support and put more and more pressure on governments. So now I'd like to introduce Matt Keane, the Minister for Energy and Environment in the New South Wales Government. This is a sitting week, so Minister Keane cannot join us live. He sent a video that we will now play.
Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to address the University of Sydney and ANU Climate Update. Climate change is an issue which is central to the purpose of the university in the modern age. Nothing is more salient to the future of human flourishing than climate change. It's an environmental challenge, it's a technological challenge, and it's a political challenge. Universities have been central to the development of new solutions to reduce carbon emissions. But the work is far from done. We need more innovation, more analysis, more experimentation, and more cooperation within and across our universities if we are to harness all the opportunities of the low carbon economy. Climate change is my number one issue, and the implementation of the New South Wales energy policy is my number one priority. At the end of last year, we legislated the biggest reform to energy in generations. New South Wales now leads the nation in responding to climate change. In fact, we believe our reforms are a template for national action and will make us a leading destination for green investment. The Electricity Infrastructure Investment Act provides the legislative superstructure for the New South Wales Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap and sets us on a path to replace our coal-fired power stations with renewable generation, to build the new transmission lines to allow those generators to connect to the grid, and pumped hydro, batteries and gas to keep the system stable and reliable. We've legislated a framework that will deliver 12 gigawatts of renewable power plus 2 gigawatts of long duration storage by 2030. We can confidently forecast that the roadmap will drive up to $32 billion in private sector investment in regional energy infrastructure by 2030 and lead to savings of around $130 per annum for the average household electricity bill between 2023 and 2040. And it is anticipated to reduce carbon emissions by 90 million tonnes by 2030. Already this year, we've announced a $32 million pumped hydro powered battery project to be located near Albury. It will be the first co-located battery and hydro project in the nation. And there is much more to do. We've designed the plans so that communities which host the new renewable power of the future get to reap the benefits, and lease payments to New South Wales landowners will help to drought-proof traditional farming communities. Climate change is not a problem for the future, it's a problem we are dealing with today. Whilst the most pressing climate change issue is reducing our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, we can't lose sight of the need to take urgent action today to protect our precious native plants and animals. Our environment faces grave challenges from climate change, from invasive species, and from poorly considered decisions of the past. Permanently reserving national parks is the cornerstone of biodiversity conservation in New South Wales. More than 290,000 hectares have been added to the New South Wales National Park Estate, smashing the state's target to increase the footprint by 200,000 hectares by 2021. I've now doubled that commitment to 400,000 hectares by the end of 2022. New parks like Narriara Kappundi Swamp National Park, which is the largest single addition to the National Park Estate in our history, will help protect the natural and cultural heritage of New South Wales in perpetuity. To stem the tide of waste polluting our environment, we're going to fix the problem of single-use plastic bags and release a new 20-year waste strategy to reduce and reuse waste. The plan will kickstart a circular economy and will help reduce the impact of waste in the environment and reduce our carbon footprint. And we're working on ways to encourage the use of electric vehicles and non-polluting public transport, kicking off with our zero emissions bus trials. We're also looking at ways to expand the electric vehicle fast charging network right across New South Wales. The government is leading by example, setting ourselves a target of 30% of the fleet of government passenger cars to be hybrid or fully electric by 2023. So much of what we are achieving in New South Wales in carbon emission reduction owes its success to the science and innovation undertaken at your universities. The government is going to continue to back that research and development with programs like our Clean Technology Program, the Emerging Energy Program, the Innovation Launchpad, and Collaborate to Innovate program. We are determined that New South Wales will lead the world in clean energy innovation and to reap the benefits of leadership in the low carbon economy of the future. And I look forward to working with you to make the most of these opportunities to build a better, cleaner, and more prosperous future for everyone in New South Wales.
I do wish the Minister were here to join us and answer some of our questions, but we'll do that next time. So I do want to thank Minister Keane for that video and his staff for helping us out. And now I'd like to introduce Georgina Woods. George has been a long-time environmental activist working on nature conservation and the causes of climate change. She's currently New South Wales coordinator for Lock the Gate Alliance and is a founding member of the Hunter Jobs Alliance, which she'll speak about tonight. George.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you, ANU and UNSW, for inviting me tonight. I'm coming to you from Worimi country in the north of Newcastle, so I want to begin by paying my respects to Worimi elders past and present, and to the spirits and ancestors of this land, and to Wabakal people as well, the other traditional owners in the Newcastle area. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about my special subject, which is the Hunter Valley and its mining industry, because I think a lot of people say a lot of things about this region without, necessarily acknowledging a lot of what's really special about it and really interesting about the challenges that it's facing. The Hunter region is roughly 8% of New South Wales's economy and indirectly drives about 28% of the state's economic output. We host 30% of New South Wales's power generation, but the Hunter is also New South Wales's biggest wine region and produces 11% of our milk and 17% of our commercial pasture seed. It's also the state's largest coastal catchment and hosts Australia's largest saltwater coastal lake and an internationally significant wetland estuary. The Grattan Institute has estimated that the Hunter has around 16,300 workers in high carbon intensity work, particularly in thermal coal mining. But the mining industry and our 4 coal-fired power stations also underpin much broader economic activity. The Tomago aluminium smelter, for example, which is said to support 4,000 jobs in the region. It is a diverse region. Large numbers of people work in manufacturing, in health, and at all levels of education. It's in Singleton and Muswellbrook in the valley where dependence on coal mining is most pronounced. Mining contributes 58% of the economic output of Muswellbrook and Singleton and employs around 40% of people in the valley. The signposts are clearly telling us that now is the time to prepare for change in the Hunter. 4 of New South Wales's 5 coal-fired power stations are expected to close in the next 15 years, and all of them are in this region, 2 in Lake Macquarie and 2 in Muswellbrook. The countries that buy our export coal are committing to net zero emissions and introducing policy to control air pollution and respond to climate change. There was a dramatic drop in the price of coal about 6 years ago when world coal production fell for the first time by 220 million tonnes, and consumption of coal began to fall too. And that incident gave us a taste of what's to come for our region. The Hunter's mining industry responded to that mini crisis by laying off several thousand workers and increasing the volume of coal they were producing overall. Every region that fails to respond to economic change says 2 things: that they wish they had started planning when they had the chance, and that they wish they had worked together. And that perspective is reflected in the academic literature. A synthesis study of coal mining regions around the world that have experienced structural decline found that the decline of mining left long-term effects on specific regions with high dependency ratios, low educational attainment, below average wages, and stagnation of wages, as well as environmental problems related to site remediation. The literature indicates this is a legacy in part of a failure to anticipate and prepare for the transition. And that research underscores the importance of anticipation, the length of time adjustment takes, the scale of investment that's needed, the importance of local knowledge, and crucially, the degree of acceptance in the community about the need for that adjustment. So what I want to say to you all about this tonight is that the people of the Hunter region have the experience, knowledge, relationships, commitment to managing our adjustment, and we need governments to back the community and local leadership to do it. The people of the region have experienced mining downturns. Places like Cessnock already know the long legacy of disadvantage that it leaves in its wake. It's a common feature, as I said, of coal mining and resource communities that they have had previous experience of structural adjustments, either because of commodities cycles or changing global markets or government decisions like the privatisation of the electricity sector. These communities have direct experience of the successes and pitfalls of such processes, and it's knowledge that the New South Wales government and the industry need if we're to manage the transition and diversification process in a way that leads to greater sustainability, prosperity, security, and opportunity. Moreover, what I think the people of this region really love it and value it and have a lot more invested in what it looks like in 50 years' time than most of the political and corporate players that we hear talking about the Hunter on the national stage. But the really big decisions about land use, economic planning, and the future of the Hunter aren't being made here. Around 80% of the coal that we mine here is exported. That's where the bulk of those 16,000 livelihoods are based. So the future of our industry and our region at this point depends on decisions that are made in other countries, particularly in Japan, South Korea, and China, and in the boardrooms of the mostly foreign-owned mining companies that operate here. We've got a political culture in Australia that means our governments are letting the interests of capital and the market make the big decisions about decarbonisation in Australia. And that approach is going to leave workers and the environment in the lurch. We're coming from a long way behind, precisely because governments have given corporations more power and trust than they have given to the public. Work is insecure, its conditions are antisocial, income inequality is growing, biodiversity is in crisis, and of course, as Mark outlined, we are currently on track to leave our children and our descendants with catastrophic climate change. There's actually a lot of agreement in this region that this change is coming. The New South Wales government, the Reserve Bank, the mining companies, they are all aware that structural decline of thermal coal is coming and that it will hurt the Hunter much more than it will hurt New South Wales or the rest of Australia. But they haven't given the people with the most passion and energy and the biggest stake in the problem a seat at the table to chart our way out of it. And so all of that is the context for why 13 local and statewide unions and environmental groups have now come together to create the Hunter Jobs Alliance, which is a historic collaboration that aims to move beyond the stale jobs versus the environment sloganeering that has prevented the region from forging its path to adjust and transform in response to declining markets for coal. The Hunter Jobs Alliance was an initiative of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, which teamed up with Labor Environment Action Network to bring other organisations together to focus on our shared vision of full employment, good union jobs, a thriving and healthy living environment, an equitable society, a stable climate, and renewable prosperity. And I want to say that this isn't about loading up action on climate change with extraneous issues that become obstacles to effective action. It's just the opposite. It's a recognition that unsustainability and social injustice are bound up with causing climate change and are obstacles to us preventing it from getting much worse. It's a recognition that involving people in conversation about these difficulties actually makes it easier, not harder, and that openness and consensus are our only options. I personally have had lots and lots of conversations with workers and community members in the Hunter, and I know that the Hunter Jobs Alliance is based on a strong foundation of community sentiment. One of the difficulties that the Alliance is confronting is the political simplification that has hampered Australian climate change and energy policy for years. If you listen to some politicians, the Hunter region has no choice but to chain our fate to the thermal coal market. If you listen to some environmentalists, it seems like action on climate change is simply a matter of technology. But meeting climate change commitments and preventing the disasters that Mark was unfolding for us is not simply a matter of replacing coal-fired power stations with renewable energy, particularly not in the Hunter, where coal mining for export, aluminium production, other carbon-intensive industries play complex and crucial roles in our region's economy, culture, and identity. Coal's material role in shaping that identity, the sense of place, the social and cultural institutions in generational mining regions like this one, must be the foundation for any effective diversification strategy. Technology is crucial, of course. Innovation can save the Tomago aluminium smelter from closing and the Hunter's industrial base from closing with it, and ensure that Hunter aluminium can compete in a low carbon world. But it won't do that without timely structural incentives and public investment. It won't do it without a public that sees and understands why those investments are being made. Similarly, the region's 150 million tonnes of polluting coal ash waste can become the basis of new manufacturing and construction projects that will reduce heavy metal pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. But that is only going to happen with policy shifts that penalise power stations for leaving that ash languishing and polluting waterways. Environmental action is job creation. I am really excited about the Hunter Jobs Alliance. I feel myself already quite transformed as an environmentalist from taking part in it and learning about the needs and perspectives of the trade unions that are part of the Alliance. And I have observed already that it has shifted the way the region is being perceived both here and externally. So terribly grateful for the opportunity to talk about it tonight. Thanks so much for listening.
That's beautiful. Thanks, George. And look, I think, it's really crucial to get at the reality on the ground of the kinds of vacuous claims for, we're going to go carbon zero or the market will take care of things. So it's really crucial to understand the impacts on everyday life that we see, especially in the Hunter. So thanks very much. Finally, I'd like to introduce Professor Jacqueline Troy. Professor Troy is the Director of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research at the University of Sydney, and her own research focuses on documenting, describing, and reviving Indigenous languages, as well as the use of Indigenous research methodologies and community-engaged research practices. And she'll be speaking tonight about impacts on Aboriginal communities. Jackie.
Well, Yuma from Ngunnawal Country, Canberra, and usually I would be in Sydney on Gadigal land where my University of Sydney sits. So I'm fortunate to be Aboriginal. I'm Ngarigu of the Snowy Mountains of southeastern Australia. There have been many times in my life where it hasn't been so fortunate for me to be Aboriginal, but we are at a stage now in Australia, and I think there's a growing sensibility worldwide of the knowledge and the traditions and the understanding of the environment, particularly, that Indigenous people worldwide have. So in thinking to myself, what is it that we can contribute to this, what shouldn't be a raging debate? It should just be everybody's pitching behind stopping climate change. I guess I would say up front that everybody does need to get just a little bit Indigenous, and I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here. It's a pity the minister isn't with us. I'd like him to get a little bit more Indigenous. While it's wonderful to see renewable energy being produced in so-called non-destructive, non-carbon emitting schemes. The latest hydroelectric scheme in Australia is doing terrible damage to the high country, damaging a fragile ecosystem that does a lot of work in filtering carbon, storing carbon. We are a very dry country. Why we have hydroelectric schemes defeats me. We could have so much more happening with wind power and, water. We're surrounded by the oceans, and also solar power. Aboriginal people in Australia were not and have not and are still not in the business of destroying our country. In many cases, we are forced into agreements where governments destroy our country. I don't know who agreed to the destruction of the snowy area called the ravine, but it will do permanent damage to my environment and it's your environment too. Everybody who's an Australian, this is our environment being destroyed, and the destruction is contributing to the further demise of the planet through climate change. In the most recent fires, my own totem, the mountain Galaxia. Now I'm just going to try and show you a picture of this beautiful little fish, my little fish. Am I going to share my screen here? Right. Can you all see the mountain Galaxia there? This is the Kosciuszko Galaxia.
I don't think the screen share's kicked in, Jackie.
It hasn't?
No, not on this
end. Share screen. Is that working?
Oh, yeah. That's working
okay.
now.
Sorry, I turned it off. So this is the Kosciuszko Galaxis. As you can see, its conservation status is critically endangered. Well, it may actually be extinct now. One way or another, climate change has killed off my totem. This is my personal totem, little river fish. It's a little carnivorous river fish that keeps down mosquito larvae, and it has its place in the ecosystem, an important place. It didn't ask for much. It just had some very small areas, as you will see in this little scientific summary, found in a very small area of the Mount Kosciuszko National Park, New South Wales. Well, it wasn't the fire that killed it. It was the runoff from the ash being swept into these small habitat areas of this fish, that choking the waters has probably meant its end in the wild. It's also not something, it used to be that you could buy these in pet shops. I even had some in ponds in my garden, but they're so rare now that they haven't even been seen in most of the aquarium shops for the last 7 years. These were not wild caught, but you can't get them anymore. So climate change. So what is it for me as a person? What my responsibility to this fish, as it is my personal totem, is that I should look after it. I should care for it because it cares for me. So back to my earlier point, what is it that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and all Indigenous people in the world can really contribute to this debate? I think more than anything, we can contribute a sensibility that we are all absolutely dependent on every other aspect of the environment. We cannot live without the environment around us and everything that's in it. Live sentient, non-sentient. Some people don't even believe there is such a thing in our Aboriginal world. There is no such thing. Everything is sentient. Every rock, every grain of sand. And if you think about the world like that, you care for it in a way that comes from a place of understanding that your life depends on its life. Everything depends on everything else. And in fact, this is actually what we've just been discussing in this panel. Every single thing has an effect on everything else. And if we don't get the balance right and we kick something way out of balance, then absolute catastrophe begins to happen. The fires at the beginning of this year also nearly killed me. So as it was killing off my totem, well, it's post-fire with the rain that, as I said, swept the ash down. As the fires were raging in my region, in Ngunnawal country, as well as in Ngurrugu country up in the Snowy Mountains, the ash in the air had an impact on me as it did on a number of other people in Australia. I think some hundreds, maybe thousands of people. I had developed an asthma that was to this particular kind of mix of smoke in the air. I understand that I think they were hopping mice or some small local marsupial mice that were in a facility studying them also died from smoke inhalation. I nearly died from smoke inhalation. I have recovered, I hope, but I was on ventilation, and if I hadn't kept coughing and my daughter got me to hospital in the first week of January, I would have choked to death. And my lungs could have been permanently damaged. It's hard to know whether they are or not. There are a lot of people who are in this situation. So, you know, the thing is, we are all part of this whole. And again, I feel I'm preaching to the converted, but we can't just take one thing and say, well, look, this industry will fix, something like the hydroelectric industry will fix the problem. It's the case that we need to think about everything we're doing in context and take on this Indigenous sensibility about being connected to the environment. Take on Indigenous fire management practices. This is something that is, I mean, again, why is it even being debated? Clearly, Aboriginal people have been, it's now, the archaeological record demonstrates that we've been in this country, what we now call Australia, on this landmass for at least 64,000 years. That's conclusively dated evidence of human occupation. And as possibly as far back as 72,000, and some people are even pushing it to 120,000 years as evidence of human occupation. So that's a long time to get to know this place quite intimately. And one of the things that we did was manage it. We farmed it. We used fire as our practice for managing the country. We managed it in a way that is now proving to be very effective. Some people have said that this time Canberra didn't burn as it did back in 2002 and 3 in the horrendous fires then, because we've made fire breaks around Canberra doing traditional burns. Detractors would like to say, oh, no, you know, Aboriginal people don't really know what they're doing. It's all sort of reinvented practice. But it seems to be working. The fires actually up in my country were not as bad as they could have been. And again, the areas that weren't badly burnt, there's evidence for the Indigenous fire management practices having a significant impact on protecting those areas. I've got a couple of pictures of my own country that is, can you see this now? Screen sharing. So this is a great forest giant down at Yarrangobilly this is the kind of, one person asked about what areas are not recovering. Pretty much from Namaji National Park right through almost up to Kyandra, there are areas that are just so badly burnt. There's very little evidence of regrowth. So this is a huge tree that lost all its canopy and most of its body structure. It's putting out some leaves. This is a year later. Usually these trees are looking much more, you know, they're covered in a much better leaf cover by this stage a year after a fire than we're seeing. I've got another image
Jackie,
too.
we couldn't actually see the tree, sorry.
Oh,
do you mind
okay.
just trying again?
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think, no, that's okay. Let me see. I'll screen share again. I think I'm not very familiar with using this. There you go. Right. Okay. Oh, actually,
Beautiful.
can you see
Yes.
that?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is this massive tree, very, very ancient tree. You know, at least 100, maybe 200 years old. And this is all it's been able to do in, I'm looking from its base up, it's completely lost its canopy. And this is, you know, it's more than 12 months. I'll show you another image now of looking out across the valley. So this is looking out through my core country. This is through into the ravine area from Yarrangobilly. And you look at this landscape and, you know, there's some ground growth happening, but there's as far as the eye can see, and this goes on for thousands and thousands of hectares, the trees are still, their entire canopy's missing. They've got all this sort of beginning of regrowth on their trunks, but that's the sort of thing that trees put out when they're almost about to die. So these trees are struggling to recover, but it's going to take decades for this area, and all the park rangers that know the area well as well are saying that it's just, they've never seen anything like it. And some of the areas I drove through, I didn't get out and photograph it, I just find it too distressing. It's just still grey. It's grey. It's been burnt so far down into the ground that there's nothing even growing on the ground. There are the logs are sort of lined up down the hill as that, looking like bodies at a crematorium. It's just very hard to describe. So anyway, so I guess what I'm calling for is, in addition to our scientific engagement with the, you know, the facts of how to stop the industry, or how to modify the industries, how to move away from mining coal, from doing things that are actually obviously putting carbon into the atmosphere. We really need to work on mining the human engagement with the planet. I know there are a lot of people talking about it, but I'd like to see some way of Indigenous people actually taking a lead alongside government. I think a lot of the people we have as Indigenous leaders now aren't necessarily people who are expert in this field. I just sat next to a young astrophysicist. My daughter, Lara, has just started at the Australian National University today studying environment and sustainability. And there was another young woman at the Jumbana Centre who's in her 4th year. There's a whole raft of young Aboriginal people coming through who are, this is what they're choosing to do. You know, they could do anything, but they want to study about our environment. And I'd like to see them given a voice. I'd like to see them nurtured. I mean, as those sort of staggered interventions that we've been talking about in this panel from a scientific point of view are being engaged with, I suggest that we need to be engaging with a staggered response to bringing on human populations and engaging with the Indigenous experience worldwide. My other area of research at the moment is Northwest Pakistan in Sawat, and they had their second massive flood in 10 years. They had one in 2010, and another one last year. On top of the pandemic, they had to go through this shocking flood, and that's because their glaciers are melting and they've got more glaciers in that region than anywhere else in the world. This is the Hindu Kush. They are melting at a rate that's unprecedented. So these are usually 100-year floods. They're coming every 10 years now, and maybe it will be even more recently, more often than that. And one of the things that makes the floods so much worse is that in 2009 and 2008, the Taliban came in and cut down the forests and made the mountains so much more unstable. So it's this combination of human damage that's that kind of damage, in addition to environmental degradation, in addition to the industry that is creating carbon problems. Sorry, I think I've talked too long. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And thanks for, literally grounding the conversation in landscapes, in lungs, in totems, and in a variety of knowledges. So that's deeply appreciated. Look, we're going to turn now to a Q&A. So remember to not just write your questions in the Q&A, but go ahead and vote up the ones that you would like to hear or hear answered. And so what I'll do is I'll just read from the top of that list and maybe pick someone to answer the question. And then we'll see if we go from there. So first up, Chris, thanks very much. If every state and territory already has a net zero emission target, why does it matter if the federal government does not? Wouldn't it be more important to put pressure on communities via councils, for example, and high emitting industries to set their own net zero targets? Mark, do you want to try that? I can respond to that as well, but you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll start. So I think there's a whole raft of responses to that. One of them is simply momentum. If we had all levels of government working in the same direction, I think it adds momentum to the change. I think it also adds consistency to that change, which I think is really important because it means there's nowhere to hide for free riders, people who want to essentially free ride the system. It also provides that consistency provides, in a sense, a balanced sort of approach across different jurisdictions. So it provides that hopefully common sets of targets. So, you don't get the cross-border issues if you have separation of targets across different jurisdictions. I think it leads to increased efficiencies because you can actually have work which is being done in the Commonwealth, which is actually done on behalf of all of the states, and sometimes vice versa. So it's the national cabinet sort of argument about things. There's also, I think, an argument in terms of trade. Critically, there are prospects of things called carbon border taxes. So taxes that other countries or jurisdictions like the EU might put on Australia because we're not adequately pricing carbon and not taking adequate action on climate change. And because the federal government is particularly responsible for trade relationships, I think that comes into play as well. And so there's a whole range of reasons why we want that, I think, consistency across governments.
That's great, Mark, thanks. And there's also just the, in addition to all of that, there's just the national responsibility that we have in terms of Paris. And that's not just for net zero, but that's for reevaluating the commitments every few years. So it's nice that the states are doing what they do, and Chris, you're right about that. But there is an absolute necessity for the government not just to set net zero, but to illustrate how they're going to get there. The second question is for Georgina, and it really is just for more information. Can you elaborate a bit on the 100 Jobs Alliance? How do you get different actors with different agendas in the room together? That's a good classic question. What are the key projects that the Alliance is implementing together in the near future to address the transition?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Look, as I said, it really was spearheaded by the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. And I think it grew out of a lot of discussions taking place at the grassroots level. So there's really a sort of a to and fro from above and below, and conversations happening in, in both at the top and the bottom about it. I mean, I don't think people from outside the hunter always appreciate just how cognizant people are of the discussions that are underway and the threats that this region faces if we do act effectively on climate change and don't do anything to adjust to that. So, I mean, I think that the different organisations that are part of the Alliance really use their strengths and their networks to talk to people about being part of it. I spoke to quite a few environment groups about it. The AMWU spoke to a lot of unions about it, and it did take us quite a number of months to meet together and talk about what our common platform was. We have a vision statement, which is on the Hunter Jobs Alliance website, which really was the kind of starting point. Once we had crafted that, it was about ensuring that everyone's perspective and experience and priorities were reflected in that statement, so that we have confidence and trust that we're going to work together in a way that is mutually respectful and supportive. As to what we're going to do, we're going to launch on the 4th of March in Maitland, and after that, again, it's going to be a combination of grassroots campaigning on the ground, so getting out and talking to people. That really is, from what I have read, one of the most important aspects of effective transition planning is community consensus and awareness and knowledge, and that's really something that the New South Wales government has failed to do. And that AGL failed to do, really, when it implemented its Liddell task force years ago, trying to get, a clear transition pathway for that power station. There was very little awareness and sort of sight of it in the general population. So we're going to be doing lots of that, of just talking to people in, union rooms and public meetings and events and stalls, but then we're also going to be going to the businesses and to the government to kind of put workers and the environment on the agenda, because, as I said, there are actually a lot of conversations happening behind closed doors in the Hunter about the region's future and how to prepare for it. There's no big money on the table yet, which is a massive gap, and there's no public process that's actually been initiated yet. And so those are the really big gaps, and that's going to be a key focus for us, is getting a transitional authority created, ensuring that public has access to it and visibility of it, and getting large sums of public investment to flow into it. There's already action happening, locally. The regional organisation of councils has tried to establish a foundation to invest in transition enterprises, and there will need to be, I suppose, a mosaic of things, because the lower Hunter and the upper Hunter are quite different. And we have, as I said, quite a diverse economy. So we have service industries, we have manufacturing, and we have people with expertise in mining who can, do lots of engineering and environmental remediation of mine sites. So I guess that's a very long and complicated answer, because it is a complicated problem, but mostly it's going to be about ensuring that we're looking after each other, and that the environmental sector is advocating for environmental policies in a way that ensures that there are good working conditions and secure unionised jobs, and that the unions are mindful of the environmental imperatives that we take seriously.
Thanks, George. And you actually got to a good part of the question that was the next in line from my colleague at Sydney Law, Madeline Taylor. But part of that, as well as another colleague of mine at Sydney, Melissa Haswell, ask about the gas-fired recovery and how communities can respond to or fight this sort of national government focus. Specifically on a gas-led recovery. And maybe I'll ask Jackie to respond to that as well, because obviously gas as another greenhouse gas is not going to solve the kind of problems that Mark laid out and will only exacerbate the kinds of issues that Jackie brought up as well. So maybe if both of you could respond to that briefly.
Thanks. Look, there is a great deal of resistance already in the Hunter and northwest of New South Wales to the gas industry expansion, which really does seem to be sort of demanding political underpinning. Like, it's not as if the gas industry, unlike the coal mining industry, doesn't seem to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. It has to have this kind of political support and intervention and subsidising and underwriting in order to get underway. So I think that's a sort of a measure really of how much confidence most of the investment and capital sector has in the idea of a gas-led recovery. And people who live along the pipeline of the Queensland Hunter Gas route from, from Moree down to Newcastle are resisting the construction of that, or the sort of preliminary surveys for that pipeline. So I think the answer really is the same as it ever was: people organising locally and working together in groups, because, like I said, most of the decisions about big projects like this are really not made in the areas where people are going to be affected by them, and where the decision makers are going to have to look in the eye of the people who are suffering the consequences of it. So taking back that power to the regions and making sure that regional people are making themselves heard is, I think, a big part of pushing back on that gas agenda.
You're muted, Jackie.
Oh no, I can't believe I'm still doing that. Basically the Indigenous communities are so badly consulted when it comes to any of the decisions around what's going to happen on their countries. It almost seems to pit all the different Aboriginal factions against each other. And in fact, I don't know that we really are factional. The people have been turned into factions around fighting over resources that don't really make any great difference to anybody's lives. So I think it's important that the wider community works with the Indigenous community to share a voice. This real concern about the local environment and about local places, and harnesses what I would say is the good opinion of Aboriginal people and the good understanding of country, not sort of bring, what often happens is that people are brought in from an area that don't have, it's not actually their own country that they live on, to sort of agree to things. That's another thing that I find government doing. That's what they're doing with the wider population. It's, as you're saying, Georgina, the decisions aren't made at that local place where people have to actually face up to the people they're going to be damaging. But I also just wanted to throw in that Aboriginal people have got all sorts of very clever solutions to the energy issues in Australia, renewable energy particularly. Down in South Australia at Yapala, the community there have access to a town that was a coal mine, and I was talking to Tony Masters about this, and they had ideas about having that as a research centre. There's plenty of sun there, and the issue is saving the electricity. Saving the energy that's produced from renewable sources like sun, of course. So they've got this huge pit which could be potentially turned into a giant battery. So there are all these sort of post-mining, post-industrial sites that Aboriginal people live with all the time that could be used in alternative ways. And Aboriginal people are talking about doing these things that are, if you like, Western science, non-Indigenous science, but married up with an Indigenous way of thinking about how to use the resources of the land, including where the resource is a newly created resource.
Thanks, Jackie. And Mark, I know you wanted to jump in here, but maybe I'll add another question to you as well. In addition to the gas question, there's a question about Hunter Energy's proposal to convert Redbank Power Station to burn 1 million tons of native hardwood. And maybe you want to give a response to wood burning I guess going from a 19th century technology going even further back as opposed to going forward.
Thank you for that, David. So just some further comments on the gas side of things. So gas is often sold as a cleaner fuel, like less carbon dioxide per unit of electricity or energy. And in some cases, at the point of combustion, that's true. But in other cases, depending on the type of gas-fired power, it can actually just be just as dirty as a coal-fired power station. And then when you take into account the value chain emissions, so leakage in terms of transmission, often it's not that different from coal. You know, like it doesn't look quite as clean when you do a more comprehensive analysis of that. And the last point I'll just make is that often gas is sold as a clean energy solution because it's actually being allied, at least rhetorically, with carbon capture and storage. So that's the solution, how we can have our energy cake and our greenhouse gas emission reduction at the same time. The problem is that carbon capture and storage is a very challenging proposition. It's incredibly energy intensive, so it uses a lot of energy to actually capture the carbon and then inject it back underground. And it's problematic from a profitability point of view. So even just 2 weeks ago, the only commercial carbon capture and storage unit in the US closed down, Petronova. It wasn't making a buck. The owners have effectively closed it down and mothballed it. And so and even then, that carbon dioxide was actually being used to enhance oil recovery. So there was actually a distinct profit motivation from doing that carbon capture. And so you take, and they had federal subsidies in the US as well. So, this was in a sense the best possible situation for a CCS plant to work, and it still didn't make money. So we have to be very careful about, thinking that is going to solve the clean gas equation. I don't know a lot about the Red Bank timber proposition, but it seems very problematic to me from a point of view of the natural resources in terms of biodiversity. When you burn timber, you not just burn carbon, you burn a whole stack of nutrients there. So you're actually decoupling the nutrient cycle in the location, and so you're making it more depauperate and reducing future growth prospects. It seems to me, a pretty problematic proposition when you look at the different dimensions of value that you need to assess when it comes to such a proposition.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe back to you, George, for a couple of quite specific questions. One is about, massive battery storage, just the idea of battery storage. And of course, there's one plan for the Hunter. Can you talk a little bit about how that affects employment, what the job prospects are around batteries? And then there was another question which you might have fun answering about why Joel Fitzgibbon doesn't support the alliance.
Thanks, David. Well, I'm glad you asked me about that battery for a different reason, because it does, I think, highlight one of the interesting points of challenge in an organisation like the Hunter Jobs Alliance, and in a complicated process like the Hunters Transition Challenge, because that battery is proposed to be built in critical habitat for a critically endangered bird, a very important patch of woodland in the Lower Hunter, where they tried to create an industrial estate many years ago, and it's sort of languished undeveloped ever since. And I think that really underscores why we need planning rather than just this sort of, let's just let the market decide what we should do and where and how. We need planning to ensure that we are protecting biodiversity. We need planning to ensure that people get jobs that aren't just casualized, and that, proper electricians are actually doing the work of installing solar installations, and all of that gamut of social and environmental and economic safeguards that actually build the vision of where we want to be when we get to the end, in decades into the future, are actually the job of government and the community to plan, rather than just taking a hands-off approach and letting any company propose any kind of renewable energy development and saying it must be a good thing. I don't know the number of jobs in battery. I assume it's not going to be much in ongoing operation, and it'll be mainly a construction prospect. And that, I think, also it's a very important point to acknowledge, because we commissioned a report a couple of years ago into sort of the challenge of creating sort of the same number of jobs that would actually replace the very large number of jobs that are currently in thermal coal exports in the Hunter. And that report did some modelling and sort of found that, look, just if we just replace the energy of coal with renewables, that really wouldn't create the same labour-intensive job opportunities that would effectively provide employment on an ongoing basis. We need a manufacturing industry that can actually build solar panels here, that can actually build wind turbines here, that can build componentry and then start exporting them from a container terminal in Newcastle Port. So there's a whole integrated idea of what it is to be a sustainable society, a circular economy, as the Minister said, which we're really not kind of getting our heads around at the moment because of this problem of taking a hands-off approach when it comes to thinking about the social and environmental consequences of our actions. Oh, and Joel Fitzgibbon, I think you just have to ask him.
That's why I skipped the Minister Keane question as well. Look, I think that's just an absolutely crucial point. So many people focus naively on this one-to-one counting of, this job versus that job. And transition isn't about that. Transition is about a broader economic transition, and that economic transition should build a more sustainable economy, not just jobs on batteries. Look, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to move to a question for everyone, really. And it's about, this event. We've heard from a Liberal minister, we've heard from an activist, we've heard from, an Indigenous perspective. How can we overcome political polarization in Australia in order to get some serious federal action on climate change? And I've got my own ideas about that, but maybe we do a go around and see what you all think in closing. Mark?
Okay, I'll start. Look, I guess this is a big challenge. Ultimately, I just think the gap between what the public wants and expects in terms of climate change action is so big compared with what they're actually getting that ultimately that will have to close. The process of closing will happen in fits and starts, and I think we're already starting to see that. So, for example, New South Wales and Minister Keane and his approach to renewables. We just saw just a couple of days ago the West Australian opposition basically flipping completely their approach in terms of renewables and energy in WA and saying this is our future, embracing it rather than rejecting it. And so I think it's those sorts of processes which are initially politically driven because they're responding to that gap. Firstly, are really good in a sort of a line in the sand sense. But they then have to have conversations which are substantive and deal with the detail. And that's where the sorts of things that Georgina's been doing in the Hunter start to cut in because it makes it real and because it allows people to see that there's a win-win here, that they can actually achieve multiple things through a transition rather than, as you say, David, the one-to-one artificial translation of job to job or the artificial conflict between environment versus jobs. We have to have a more nuanced discussion in Australia.
So we've got about a minute or two. So maybe a sentence from George and from Jackie.
Yes, my answer to that is really actually quite complicated and deep, but it just comes down to speaking with sincerity and seeking understanding. I mean, I don't think there's a formula for it. You just have to listen to people. I mean, listen to the coal miners of the Hunter, listen to, Liberal politicians. A lot of people are speaking in bad faith, but there are a lot of people simply saying, this is reality from my perspective, and a problem as complicated as climate change needs to be able to create consensus accommodating everybody's reality.
Yeah, I think for me, it's back to this sort of holistic view that Aboriginal people take and or Indigenous people worldwide to collaborate with each other, and this idea of yarning and listening and talking, but bringing the discussions together instead of having them all compartmentalized. I think that is a very good point about the polarization. It's not just a political polarization, but it's a polarization between, well, there's people who think, oh, well, whatever Aboriginal people are doing is just incomprehensible and, it's out there in some traditional no person's land that non-Aboriginal people can't understand. That's rubbish. We're all people together. We all want to look after the country. We all want to look after the whole planet. And there's a lot of understanding of that can be built up by talking about it and working things through and bringing Western science together with Indigenous science and knowledge that just is not given any credibility most of the time.
I think if I were to summarize those answers in a phrase, it would be more substantive democracy. That's really, I think, what everyone is talking about. So look, thanks to everyone for your input. Thanks for the questions. Thanks to all the speakers and attendees. This event has been recorded and it will be uploaded publicly and circulated to everyone who's registered, so you can look forward to that. I do want to thank again the incredible staff at both the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions and the Sydney Environment Institute. Please feel free to visit our website, sign up for our newsletters, pay attention to our upcoming events. But in the meantime, just thanks to everyone for coming and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, David.